Education 1030 students. So I hope everyone had a great spring break. We are ready to keep moving forward in this term. We are on chapter 6. So we're still working in unit 2, but we are on chapter 6, which is reading to learn from college textbooks. Now, this chapter is really important. We've already looked at time management strategies, resources within the college. We started looking at career and academic planning, what kind of learner you are. And now we are really going to start looking at how do I read this information and actually retain it to help me, right? So this chapter 6 is really going to help you, give you some strategies and tools for active reading, and we're going to talk about what that is, increasing your comprehension and understanding from college textbooks and how they differ in different subject matters such as science, math, and social science textbooks. Also, increasing your academic reading and vocabulary development will help you as well. So you will have several resources to help you. You obviously will read chapter 6 in your textbook. You have the PowerPoint slides that goes along with that, in addition to your reading organizer. You also have some links to watch, some supplemental videos that will help you connect more deeply with the content, which I encourage you to watch. For assessments, how are you going to be graded? Well, you will be completing a formal outline. Okay, so up to this point, you have been completing what we call reading organizers, which are also known as outlines, right? They highlight the most important things on that topic. But you are going to complete a formal outline for chapter 6. Now, outlines are important because, as I mentioned, they help us study, but also highlight the most important things that we need to know about that topic. So we're going to go over that in just a moment, and you will also be taking your chapter 6 quiz. Now, if you'll notice, chapter 6 starts on March 14th. It's open on that last day of spring break, but nonetheless, it's still going to be the same schedule. So it opens on March the 14th, and it will be due March the 20th. Okay, so you will have that Thursday, March 20th, it will be due, and that's when the chapter 6 quiz will close. So let's look real quick at these 2 videos that you are going to be watching. One of them is really going to talk about how do you actually retain what you're reading, right? So have you ever read something and you read it 2 or 3 times and you still don't understand it? Well, this video really touches on that and how to remember more of what you're reading in the specific subject matter. So this is a very useful video. The other video is talking specifically about reading more efficiently and what does that mean when we're talking about textbooks. Because textbooks are a little different than when we read for pleasure. So it's also a very good video for you to look at. So before we get into the assignment, I wanted to touch on some things in chapter 6 that I want you to focus on. So when we're looking in chapter 6, the first thing you're going to notice is going to be, what does active reading mean and what's a plan? So active reading just involves you in participating using reading strategies. So instead of just reading through the chapter, you're actually going to use strategies such as note-taking, highlighting, making notes in the margins, outlining. This is going to help you comprehend the material, but also help you study your concentration and focus, so that way you can do well in retaining the information and use it later on. Now, there are 4 steps when we talk about active reading. So there is previewing, marking what you read, staying focused, and then going back and reviewing. And a plan for active reading starts on page 129. It will go through, it's going to go through all the way until page 138. Okay, so you'll see that under each step, like previewing, you're going to have to get to know your textbook, take a chapter tour, plan your time out for reading, right? There's mapping, outlining, listing, creating flashcards. All of that is what we call preview, and that's the first step. The second step is marking what you read. This is where we start getting into highlighting and taking notes, okay? And then the third step is staying focused. There are some strategies on page 136 and 137 that really walk you through how to stay focused. And also on 137, which we'll touch back in just a minute, is an example of an organizer, a reading organizer that helps you, kind of like what you turn in to get extra points for your exam, a reading organizer, because that helps you stay focused as well. So they implemented an example of that. And then lastly, reviewing, there's some strategies on page 138 on how you actually review when you're doing active reading. Now, there are strategies that you're going to use depending on what subject matter. For instance, what you do for math when you're studying and having active reading is not what it's going to be looking like for science. Okay, so math and science, yes, are very kinesthetic and hands-on, but there are different strategies and tools you can use depending on if you're working in math or if you're working in science. And the same goes for social science or humanities. Now, when we say social science, we're talking about things like history, political science, psychology, education, those sorts of courses. When we talk about humanities, we're talking about communications, art, music, speech, those sorts of courses, English, literature. So then we move on to page 143 in your textbook, where we talk about how do you improve your reading. Well, there's several things you can do, and it talks you through different strategies. The first thing is really monitoring your reading, going back and looking at what strategies are you doing now, right? Do you understand this? Really like asking yourself, do I understand what I'm reading? What do I need to do to monitor my comprehension? Then we move on to vocabulary, right? That's an important one in developing your vocabulary when you talk about jargon from your specific subject matter, right? Defining those unfamiliar terms. And then a strategy, what to do if you fall behind in reading. Okay, so that's specifically related to your course textbook reading. So as always, you do not have to submit the Think, Write, Apply at the end of each chapter, but it is a great study tool. I always encourage students to use that. So there is a reading organizer on page 149 in the Think, Write, Apply section. You'll see it's a little different than the one that I laid out, so it might be a good idea for you to do both. That way you can see kind of which one you prefer. That would be good for you to take that piece of information and utilize it moving forward. So that's why I always encourage you to do Think, Write, and Apply. So now that we talked about the focus areas of the textbook chapter, let's look at your actual assignment. So if you go down to chapter assignments, you're going to see you have a quiz, which will close on March 20th. And then you have your outline activity, which will be due to Dropbox as well on March 20th. So let's go ahead and click on the formal outline. Okay. When you see here, and it pulls up, you're going to be thinking, what in the world is that? Okay. This first box here is just to give you an idea of the format. Now, how is this different than the reading organizer? Well, when we talk about a formal outline, it uses headings and subheadings, right, to prepare. So think about if you've ever done a speech before or a research paper. You will have to do an outline. A formal outline is going to use a different format than what you're used to using, okay? So you will have to add headings and subheadings as you outline the chapter, okay? So what you're going to see here in this box is an example of them putting the heading, the main heading, and then the subheadings. So think of it like this. It does use Roman numerals and capital letters and numbers, which can be confusing to students. This is the way that I always break it down that helps me. The Roman numerals are your main headings, your main topics, the main things you're focusing on. The capital letters are just the supporting details, right? And then the numbers are just what we call gravy. Those are just examples, right? You're going one step further and giving examples. So let's say that you have your first heading here and it is going to be active reading, right? So then you would list those 4 steps of active reading. So you'd have A, B, C, D, because there's 4 steps in active reading. And then if you feel like you want to add a little gravy, you know, the first step in active reading, right, is previewing. So you could put A, previewing, and then you can maybe put some examples of how you would do previewing, right? So that's just giving you an example of what it means. Now, I do have an example here that I wanted to show you that might help you. This is one that was done by a student. So this is a formal outline for our chapter 6. Now, as you can see, this is what I was talking about, okay? Your Roman numeral is your main topic, right? So a plan for active reading was one of the main topics and highlights in chapter 6, okay? We said the capital letters are going to be your supporting details. So there we know there are 4 steps for active reading: previewing, marking what you read, staying focused, and reviewing. So what I want you to see here is under previewing, the first step of active reading, they gave you examples. Well, how do you preview? Well, you get to know your textbook. You take a quick chapter tour. You plan time for your reading. You map, you outline or list, and you create flashcards. Okay, so we told that we're working on a plan for active reading. We listed the supporting detail, which was the first step of active reading. Then we moved on to the second step, so we had to put a capital B, right? Marking what you read. And I gave examples. How do you mark what you read? And then we moved on to the third supporting detail in active reading, which is how you stay focused. And I listed the examples and strategies of how you stay focused. And then lastly, the fourth step in active reading was reviewing. And I listed the strategies and how you review, right? That covered the first important detail in my outline. One thing that might help you too is if you are using textbook, that's why we say I always do a preview, right? In your textbook chapters, they're usually, the publishing company will tell you what are going to be the most important key aspects, like how many important details you will be going over. It's usually on the profile page in ours. They're going to be 6.1, okay, that's one of the important sections. 6.2, strategies for different kinds of textbooks. That's an important strategy that should be included. And then third is improving your reading. That's also an important detail. Okay, so your textbook chapters will lay out what's the main highlights that you should focus on and how that chapter is laid out. Okay, so you'll see here, what's my second main topic? Strategies for reading different kinds of textbooks. And then here, I just listed supporting details. I told the different kinds of textbooks. Now, you could have took it a step further if you wanted. Under math, you could have gave some examples, right? Science. But that's a little harder to list because it didn't give you list, right? It didn't make it, you had to read and really try to find it like where's Waldo, so that wasn't necessary. The third strategy was improving your reading. How did you do that? And I gave some supporting details, right? So you'll see here, you monitor your reading, and I gave some examples of how to do that. Develop your vocabulary, gave you some examples of how to do that. What to do when you find behind, gave you some examples, right? And then lastly, the last one underneath improving your reading was what to do to improve your reading if English is not your first language, right? So that's kind of what an example of a formal outline looks like. It's kind of like the reading organizer. The only difference is that's very formal in how you lay it out with headings and subheadings and where you indent, and then you have to use capital letters, and your examples are always going to be numbers. Okay, so those are the differences. Remember, your Roman numeral is your main heading, your main topic. Your capital letters are always going to be your supporting details. And then underneath each supporting details, you can give examples, which you would just put numbers for. That's what we call your grading. All right, so that's a formal outline. That's what you'll be submitting to Dropbox. All right, that is it for Chapter 6. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Until next time, take